A cycle of fear. A report shows journalists are facing increasing hostility around the world. The dangers are not just in conflict zones. Harassed, persecuted, and sometimes stigmatized, they are facing a new threat. So, what's caused press freedom to deteriorate globally? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Mohammed Jamjoom. Media freedom is in decline, and journalists around the world are working in an intense climate of fear. This year's evaluation by Reporters Without Borders shows a marked drop in the number of countries where it is safe for journalists to work. And it says political leaders' rhetoric has fueled violence against them in many parts of the world. The World Press Freedom Index covers the state of journalism in 180 countries. It found 8% of them have a media climate considered good for journalists. The biggest deterioration is in the Americas, with the U.S., Brazil, Venezuela, and Nicaragua performing poorly. The Middle East and North Africa region continues to be the most dangerous for journalists. On the flip side, Ethiopia and Gambia's rankings have climbed significantly. Norway stayed top of the list, while Sweden lost one place to become third. And North Korea is no longer the most dangerous country for journalists. It's Turkmenistan. All right, let's bring in our guests from London. Aidan White, president and founder of the Ethical Journalism Network. Rami Khoury is professor of journalism at American University of Beirut. He is currently in New York to address an international forum on press freedom. And again from London, Caroline Muscat, co-founder and editor of The Shift News. Welcome to the program. Caroline, let me start with you. It used to be that journalists mostly came under threat due to violence. Covering war, covering dangerous stories. That really has changed fundamentally in the last several years, has it not?
It has. We are seeing a change in the threats and the kind of intimidation that journalists are facing. This climate of fear that we're talking about has intensified over the last couple of years. We are now looking at things like cyber harassment, the threat of legal and judicial harassment, all challenges that make journalists' life on the ground very difficult and make it very hard to work.
Rami, I want to start the discussion today by discussing the United States, a country where the notion of freedom of the press is enshrined in its constitution. Not only has the U.S. fallen in the Reporters Without Borders list this year, it's fallen 3 places in this year's index, but it is now classified as having a problematic climate for journalists. So just how significant is this?
It's very significant in terms of the modern historical legacy, where the United States, along with some Western European countries, are really champions of the independence of the press and free expression of citizens and the privacy of citizens. That's changed now, and Trump really is the latest manifestation, most dramatic manifestation of this, because he publicly, openly attacks the media and says they're enemies of the people and agitates his followers to, in some cases, the followers go and beat them up and stuff. But this did not start with Trump. This really started with George Bush and the war in Iraq, where George Bush suddenly said in the global war on terror, you're either with us or you're against us. Anybody who doesn't fully support the American government policies in war and other areas is an enemy of the people, is a danger, is a threat, is a subversive element. And this process has gone on now for about 25 years, and it's getting worse and worse, and it's spreading all over the world. But in the U.S., the interesting thing is that while the government is pushing to restrict press freedoms and personal expression and criminalize it in some cases, such as, for instance, supporting the BDS peaceful sanctions against Israel movement, the pushback from the U.S. is very serious, including the American Civil Liberties Unions and law cases all over the country, saying that the freedom of expression that is enshrined in the Constitution has to override everything else. And there's a huge battle. This is really the great new ideological battlefield in not just the Western world, but the rest of the world as well.
Aidan, the report calls the period since President Trump's election in 2016 one of American journalism community's darkest moments. And it also links Trump's notorious anti-press rhetoric with terrifying harassment, it says in the report, aimed particularly at women and journalists of color. So, from your perspective, how much have Trump's words degraded the atmosphere?
I mean, I don't think there's any doubt that notwithstanding the difficulties that past presidents have had with the press, there's no doubt that President Trump has elevated to a new and quite unacceptable level hostility to the press. He's generated a movement against mainstream press. He has tried to humiliate and to isolate and to intimidate some of the best journalists in the world. And it seems to me what he's done is he has created in the public mind a deep suspicion and hostility towards mainstream journalism. And given the circumstances that we are in internationally and globally with the information landscape, that's a very dangerous thing. In particular, he's given a green light to populist and unscrupulous politicians all around the world to bring the press and investigative journalists, for example, into the crosshairs of conflict. He is very much the leading light in a very dark force in global politics today. It includes Putin, it includes Erdogan in Turkey, it includes others who really are generating now a very hostile climate in which journalists find it difficult to work. So I don't think I've known, and I've been in this business for more than 30 years representing journalists internationally, I don't think I've known a worse period in terms of the problems and challenges facing journalists and the threats that there are to free expression.
Rami, this report says that the Americas have suffered the greatest deterioration of any of the regions. First off, why are things getting so much worse in places like Brazil and Venezuela and Nicaragua? And secondly, the fact that things are so much worse in the U.S., what does that mean for the safety of journalists in other parts of the world?
Well, the U.S. is seen as a leader across the world in many arenas, and it used to be a leader in free press. Now it's a leader in pushing back against the freedom of the press and criminalizing free expression. So anybody who's critical of Trump or American policies is seen in the Trumpian world to be an enemy and a dangerous subversive, and therefore can be attacked with legal means, sometimes just beaten up, sometimes intimidated. And this is spreading around the world. The critical thing now is that there is a global growing network of autocrats, let's call them. Some of them are really awful dictators and brutal people. Others are just really strong autocrats who don't want to hear any views that oppose them. And you see it in Brazil and in Venezuela, in Egypt and Iran and Turkey and India, Hungary. It's all over the world. It's spreading more and more. And the really dangerous thing is that they are now getting technology. For instance, the United Arab Emirates has bought Israeli technology that is passed on to President Sisi in Egypt to monitor electronically hundreds of thousands of people and prevent them from expressing themselves. So we have the situation where thousands of websites were just closed down in Egypt a few days ago by the government in order to prevent the free discussion about the so-called referendum that's going to take place now in a few days that would allow Sisi to stay president for another 20 years or so. So the web of terrible things happening is much worse than just clamping down on journalists. It's about controlling the minds, the thoughts, and the expressions of individual citizens and preventing citizens from working together in NGOs or professional organizations or whatever to express themselves and hold the governments accountable. So this is really a dangerous moment, but the good news is that there is pushback everywhere in the world, and this is a great global battle now taking place.
Caroline, the European Union and the Balkans are registered this year as the second biggest deterioration in this regional score, which measures the level of constraints and violations. That's according to the Reporters Without Borders report. Tell us about the kind of threats faced by journalists in Malta.
Well, Daphne Caruana Galizia, an investigative journalist, was assassinated in Malta on 16th October 2017. There is no real serious investigation going on. 3 known criminals were accused of the assassination, but we have absolutely no idea who commissioned the murder. the silencing of an investigative journalist in Malta, a country where more than 90% of the media is owned directly by political parties, leaves very little room for criticism of the government. There is continued impunity, and this continues to make the rest of the journalists working on the ground more and more vulnerable. The threats and the cycle of hate that investigations have revealed are directly linked to online government portals, closed and secret groups that were used to whip up hate against Caruana Galizia, are now being used to target and isolate activists and journalists who are critical of the government. Once you're isolated, you become a much easier target, and the Maltese government is refusing national and international calls for an independent public inquiry to look at what the state could have done to prevent the assassination, the state's positive obligation. The government is refusing this call.
Aidan, in this report, Sweden is highly ranked, but even Sweden was downgraded this year, and one of the reasons for that was because of cyberbullying of journalists, and this is something that keeps coming up in the Reporters Without Borders index this year. What do you make of that?
Well, I think the problem about the use of technology to monitor the work of journalists, to interfere and to intimidate journalists in the way that they're working, is extremely disturbing. And I mean, Sweden has been demoted, but you know, in terms of the league table, the Scandinavian countries are still outshined by a long way most of the rest of the democratic world and globally as a whole. But I think this problem about technology is not just about how the technology can be used and developed specifically to target and to intimidate journalists. One of the big problems that we're facing in terms of protecting free expression these days is the failure of the big technology companies to take their responsibility as publishers. They have created, in many ways, the technological facilities for an information landscape that shows no respect for public decency, for respect for standards of expression. There's we have many problems with misinformation, fake news, abusive communications, and so on. And so this deterioration in the quality of public communications has added to the general problem about free expression. The public at large have no idea about how to deal with a confused landscape in which it's difficult, if not impossible, to identify what is reliable, what is truthful, what is worthwhile in terms of free expression. And this itself, therefore, causes a massive problem. So we have, with technological developments, with the utilization of technology by unscrupulous forces who will try to shut down journalism wherever it is, we also have the creation of an information landscape which is increasingly toxic. And that also is very dangerous for free expression.
Rami, you heard Aidan there talk about a toxic landscape, and what comes up in my mind is, you know, social media and how toxic a landscape that can be. Can you talk a little bit about how much of a problem that is for journalists in the Middle East, and also how much a problem cyberbullying is for journalists in the Middle East?
Yes, both of those things are an issue. Just if I can add to what Aidan said, which I agree with completely, was that we really need to understand how this started. And my sense, having lived through it and watched it all in the last 40, 50 years, it really started with the Thatcher-Reagan revolution, where they decided that free market capitalism really is the mechanism to rule the world, that all people should live in free market economies, and therefore everything becomes commodified, everything is a commodity to buy and sell, and the market rules everything. And this is what's happened to media all over the world. Started in England and the US and now is spread everywhere. The media has been broken up into hundreds and hundreds of small little groups and politicized as well as being atomized at the same time. So we don't have many centrist, reliable news sources that like we used to when I was in college in the 1960s and 70s. You could rely on the centrist major news organizations to give you relatively factual, honest, and fair news of what happened yesterday. Today, the media has become an ideological battleground, and this is going on all over the world now as well. In the Middle East, it's very obvious. Governments have controlled most of the media in most of the Middle Eastern countries, not just the Arab countries, Iran, Turkey, Israel as well. There's a massive move by governments to buy or influence or control media. And this is one of the reasons why social media has become such an important alternative to people's news, but the governments are cracking down on social media. And if somebody says something on social media that the government doesn't like, there are now laws in all countries that allow the government to detain somebody, put them in jail, just because they were accused of demeaning the leader or ruining the country's reputation, vague things like that, which, of course, the government decides, and it's the courts that it controls, decides how to interpret that. So there is a huge problem in terms of why individual journalists are having more and more difficulty getting their work done, and that's why so many of the best ones leave the Middle East and go overseas, where they can continue to work online, but they have less impact when they're outside the country. And this is because of the bullying, because of the threats, the intimidation, the imprisonment, and all of the, and of course the governments ultimately have to license almost anybody in the Middle East in any medium has to be licensed somehow. So this is a very dark moment for the region across the Middle East, as it is for many around the world. But I would add again that people are pushing back. People are not silently sitting and taking this. There are pockets of excellence and independence and quality journalism all across the Middle East. Jazeera is one of them. Meda Masr is one of them. Hibr in Jordan is one of them. There's many small groups, big groups that are doing genuinely professional work, and that's why they tend to be attacked by the autocrats.
Caroline, from your perspective, how much of a problem for journalists is cyberbullying and also the social media landscape? How much of a threat does that pose?
Well, the promise of social media, the democratization that these platforms were supposed to offer, I think ended up in the same path as every other channel that was ever created. Power has taken that over. There is no need to shut down Facebook accounts or Twitter accounts anymore. They simply just dominate through trolling. And in Malta, we have proven the direct link between state trolling and the targeting of activists and citizens. And in this sense, I agree with what was said, that these social media platforms need to take the responsibility of acting as publishers rather than neutral carriers. Like any editor or journalist that has to go through, verification, fact-checking, and face the liability and consequence when failing. These platforms need to take up that same responsibility, because the influence and the damage that they are causing are quite extreme.
Aidan, let's talk for a minute. Let's return to the theme of disinformation and how bad it's getting, particularly in Asia. I mean, let's talk for a second about Myanmar, because that is some place where disinformation, manipulation of social networks led to a lot of hateful rhetoric being directed toward the Rohingya in Myanmar, for example. You have the two reporters, Walon and Kyaw Soe. They are reporters in Myanmar. They were jailed as they were investigating an atrocity that was committed in Myanmar. They just won the Pulitzer Prize for their reporting just a few days ago. Now, there was a time when something like that would apply pressure, a prize that prestigious, a statement like that would apply pressure on a government to release journalists of that caliber so much in the spotlight. That doesn't seem to be the case anymore, does it?
No, I think that's right. I mean, I think this goes back to the discussion that we were having at the beginning, which is there's a political climate that's been created and unfortunately led by political leaders from democratic countries, which is actually enhancing the capacity for impunity in countries which were actually never very good in the first place. And so you have now a sort of fresh wind in the sails of autocrats and people who are the enemies of press freedom, really not to feel any responsibility. The Jamal Khashoggi murder, the targeted murder by Saudi Arabia of Khashoggi is the worst example in the past 12 months. But we see everywhere. Now, governments quite happy to play fast and loose with international standards and obligations. And this has created a very dangerous atmosphere. But in Asia, we are beginning to see a pushback. But there are massive problems. The problems facing Maria Ressa, the outstanding journalist in the Philippines, who's being targeted by the government there because of her work as an independent journalist. So we have to sort of recognize that there is a political struggle here to get political organizations to get back on track in terms of respecting international standards. But can I just add that I do feel the point that's been made, that there is pushback, is actually very important. This is a time where we have to reinforce the importance of journalism, reliable, professional and ethical journalism as a useful stream of information. And even in some unlikely places, we're seeing that now being taken up. Very recently, there was the creation of a coalition for ethical journalism in Turkey. There was a coalition for media organizations in the Western Balkans, both areas, both regional areas where there are massive political problems facing journalists. But there we see the journalists and media organizations and media support groups getting together to devise new strategies for pushback. This is actually a very welcome sign.
Rami, I want to discuss the issue of Julian Assange for a moment, because his arrest just several days ago, that has raised the alarm bells for many activists, many journalists, many journalism professors, lawyers, many of them saying that if he is extradited to the United States, that sets a very dangerous precedence for journalists all over the world going forward. Now, there has been a debate for a while about whether or not Julian Assange should actually be considered a journalist. But this idea of him potentially being extradited to the United States, when discussing the topic of safety for journalists, what do you make of that?
It is a big problem if he is extradited. I think the government said he wouldn't be sent to a country that has the death penalty. So we'll see what happens. But we should see this as an incremental bad step in the wrong direction in a much bigger march towards bad directions by many people all over the world. So it would create pressure on whistleblowers and people who leak information. And it really tells us that there is a central weakness that is permeating much of the media all over the world now, which is the lack of trust at all the different levels that exist. So publics don't trust the media as much as they used to. It's 20-25% roughly of different countries, people say they trust the media. The media doesn't trust what the government is telling them. The governments don't trust the media that they are dealing with. And there's a huge simultaneous deterioration in the core trust relationship that has always formed the strength of the free media world, which is that you can count on what you see in the paper or on TV or radio as being relatively accurate and fair. That no longer counts. The media has been weaponized, politicized, polarized, commercialized, privatized. All the bad things that can happen have happened to the media. And remember, the media, broadly speaking, are businesses. They're out to make money. And these businesses are now controlled by ideological extremists, some of them in government, some of them and other movements in their countries who want to exploit the freedom that there exists in the media to attack people that you don't like. So this is a very difficult combination of pressures that people deal with. And adding Julian Assange to this list of maybe him being prosecuted in the United States, it just is one more element. I wouldn't emphasize it too much because there are many, many other bad things going on that we probably have more ability to control right now.
Aidan, it looks like you're shaking your head. I'm going to give you the last word, but please be mindful of the fact that we only have about 40 seconds left. Go ahead.
All I wanted to say is that I wanted to take issue with the idea that we must regard media as businesses. Journalism actually is moving out of being regarded as a business in the market sense. Today, increasingly, journalism isn't a business in the market sense. Journalism is increasingly a public institution with public purpose, and it's first and ultimate aim is to provide reliable and trustworthy information. The question is how we can do that without pressure from governments, how we can do that and make it sustainable for the future. These are the big questions that have to be answered for the future of journalism, but also for the future of democracy.
All right, we're going to have to leave it there as we have run out of time. Thanks so much to all our guests, Aidan White, Rami Khoury, and Caroline Muscat. And thank you, too, for watching. You can see the program again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Mohammed Jamjoom, and the whole team here, bye for now.